first thing we want to do before we get going is check to ask if, for those who are here attending, do you feel like that your goals and what you are here to try to learn has been met so far?
No, not at all. I mean, I learned nothing today.
All right. Well, then we can just go. We're past the point of redemption on this one. So
I think you started meeting my goals in the first, 30 minutes here. So you're all good, at least for me.
So, I mean, we basically just want to use the remainder of our time to make the most out of it for you all, and gather a sense of, are there any topics that you feel like you would be interested in diving into a little bit more in detail, anything that came up or that you felt like didn't come up that you would be interested in digging into. We want to use this rest of the afternoon and just like an hour together to cover anything you feel like would still be useful. So I have 3 things that were touched on a little bit that I flagged as possibilities, but this is simply 3 things I wrote down. Evaluation is one of them, both programmatic and impact evaluation, funding and resources, and communications and outreach. Those are 3 things that we had involved or that came up in our discussions but wasn't addressed directly. Those are certainly not the only things that we can talk about. So I'm happy to open it up and just gather, or if there's any initial questions that you have after your break, things that you still want to cover, or we can dive into some of those things. Sure, let's Sylvia and Sasha both had thoughts.
Well, I'd like to discuss a little bit more about advocacy of mini-publics. How can we, I know that this, but to think together some ways that we can do something institutional about mini-publics. So if you can put together a material or something that can be facilitated for advocacy. Because I was thinking of translating these videos and things like that, but I don't know, maybe that's a topic that I'd like to talk.
Sasha, did you have another idea or thought?
Yeah, I've been curious about like at a large level, right? If this was to happen throughout a country, how do you optimize this type of process for a nation, and what is the competitive advantage of this type of process versus having just really strong neighborhood associations where communities are actually meeting and getting to deliberate on stuff as they come up, and those things and those neighborhood associations tier up? I don't have a clear understanding of that in my head, and I'd love thoughts about that so that I understand what a national approach might look like.
Okay. And Alex, I saw your...
Related, but a little broad and vague. I'm really interested in the relationship between mini-publics and mass public. And I think some of the CIR stuff was touching on that a bit, but I'm interested in exploring that more.
Cool. And then, did you have
So I had a couple things. Alex, I want to talk to you about unions before you and I leave. I want to come back to this concept of democracy, the word democracy potentially being a touchy word, and what are some of the alternatives that have been proposed. I would dearly love to walk away from here today with a very clear understanding of what are the core required elements for a citizens jury or citizens assembly to be a citizens jury or citizens assembly. They share a lot in common with other deliberative techniques and other types of group processes. What makes these something different than all those others, right? What are the core, the must-dos or the kernels that make this what it is? And we'll stop there. Evaluation and assessment is always an interesting concept as well. But
all right. Well, this should take us about 5 minutes. So
You're on.
If we get through those, I have one. I would want to know from everybody, and especially from folks who haven't been involved in this work, what doubts you have, what concerns you have, what when you think about, I don't know about this. That's really useful to know.
Mhm.
If we get through those others.
It's going to be a long night at the bottom.
Let's see. So I've got advocacy and materials to advance mini publics
But
institutionally.
maybe you can leave this to the last, because I think the other questions are are prior to my mind. So that-
All right.
Well, now, wait a second, though. This advocacy and materials, this is absolutely imperative.
Right.
I look all over. I spend hours looking for materials to share with my students. Hours and hours and hours. And, you know, it's like your video that you showed us, it's a great video. It's not captioned. I have to have a 3 to 6 week lead time to get somebody at my university to caption it, because I cannot use it in class without
Right.
it meeting accessibility issue standards, right? Many of these are not in Portuguese, or maybe they're in Spanish and not in English. You know, what resources are there? Is there this core group of resources that we can turn to, so that when we go back to our communities, we can say, here's what I learned, and here's some stuff I can share with you. And we've got these wonderful things that David has provided, and we have this resource page. But so I'm going to say, I actually think your advocacy and how do we share this is really important.
Yeah, I would agree, because I'm interested in this work and I developed a model, but I didn't have the nuts and bolts. So I would say advocacy plus democracy research and design. How do you get the information out to others to, you know, scale your work in whether it's from research or practice?
Yeah, and I think I will say, unfortunately, at this time we don't have that suite of resources prepared. But on the positive, the reason for that is that we've been, and this is a common thing that everyone in every organization or people face. We've been so busy doing the work that we haven't been able to step back and pool, or either do it individually or pool the resources. Now, what's positive is a recognition of the need and necessity to do that, and to have a shared set, and the actual capacity becoming available, even if it's incrementally or as part of our own communications and staff development projects at organizations. And that's what this Democracy R&D network does seek to provide, is one kind of clearinghouse for those who are doing some style of this in effective and actually doing experimentation with these processes as it's culturally, politically, or socially relevant to their context, and to have that. So it's coming, and it's in process, but it's slow because it's not any one person, or it's not something that's funded and dedicated in a clear way. So that's one side of it, is that we've been the challenge of success is that it hasn't brought with it necessarily, or success in developing more opportunities to do this work hasn't necessarily brought along with it the resources or capacity to do this type of communications and outreach development. But more organizations now are in a place where it's identified as a need. There's enough of a demand and at least bandwidth that some can dedicate to an element of this that just wasn't there a year or 2 years ago, and especially. And so that's where it's been a promising development in the last year or so.
If I understand right, that's a big piece of what you want to do in policy jury group, isn't it?
It is. I'm going to pass the buck back to Democracy R&D. That I think would be the perfect role for something like Democracy R&D. And yeah, it's something I'm excited to help with for sure. But part of the challenge that there's the advocacy piece of this with materials, which are oftentimes just shaped specifically for the context or the next set of meetings and so on. I think it'd be awesome to have a clearinghouse of those, so that people interested in mini publics can have a place to go, even if they're rough and unvarnished and out of date, just to go look at what's been said and how it's been said. And I would say the same thing for, I mean, we all have design manuals and documents and have iterated over and over and over with these things. But just to be totally candid, like, but part of the challenge in healthy democracy with like the design and logistics documents that we had early on was the fear of scrutiny. And so it's like you have a program that you feel really good about that's a work in progress, and you know, you get to a stage and then you refine it based upon feedback, and then you refine it yet again, and it's evaluated and critiqued. In our particular context, being as political as it was, there was always this real latent fear of, if we publish this stuff, people are going to poke serious holes in it, because there are so many, legitimately in some ways, because there's so many different ways to do this. But nevertheless, I think for this work to grow, that's another great potential function of democracy R&D, or somebody to try to aggregate this information and just say, hey, look, it is what it is.
Right, look.
Yeah. And,
Well, yeah, I mean, if you're already collecting this stuff, and if it's something that's within the framework that you all have been thinking of, then that seems like the logical place to turn. And if any of us develop materials or become aware of materials, then we need to send them off to you all, if that is something you would want to do.
One thing I'll just add to this is that, yeah, I agree with everything that's been said so far. And I'd like to also stress the importance, I know David and I have talked about this and see it similarly, the importance of having materials and messaging that is accessible to lay people, people who aren't super into random selection and who aren't practitioners. As Alexander, you talked about mass public versus mini public. And for those of us who are interested in bottom-up approaches to change, right? The question of advocacy, okay, well, who's our target audience? Is it policymakers and decision makers? We talked about this in Democracy R&D. Or is it a broad audience? Because those look very different as far as how you want to reach out to them. It may be a book, or it may be short videos, you know, and a lot of the work that's been done so far around this has been, you know, absolutely amazing. And a lot of it has been academic, which means that there's kind of a real gap or a lack of materials that
It's
you know.
not applied.
Well, our team, I've got a couple of teammates that have PhDs, and so they send me summaries of new articles, and I'm really appreciative.
Yeah,
they can go read them,
Right.
distill it for me, you know. But
So really, we should just get on your list when you share around this.
exactly. They'll send me the summary, and then I'll do a little video.
There you go.
But so just making sure that those are accessible not just to practitioners and policymakers, but to your students, or to people who are on the boards of foundations that are neither practitioners or policymakers.
Right.
I think the video. Go ahead. Thank you. I think the video is important, and it's the easy way to deliver the information, and we can translate the video, subscribe to Arabic or English or any language.
Right.
So I support the idea of the videos.
Yeah.
And just so you know, the video there of the Irish process, the process in Ireland, that's from Patrick Chalmers, who's working with funding from New Democracy, and he's going to be doing, it's a whole series planned out.
Cool.
So that was the first of a series, and I know that the second will probably look quite different. He's somebody who really looks for a lot of feedback and has taken a lot of feedback, but it's going to go all around the world and look at different initiatives, and it's all video. So
Cool.
That'll be a really great resource.
Khaldoon, do you know anybody who's working with mini publics in Jordan?
Actually, I have benefited a lot from this workshop, and regarding the mini publics. We as IRI work for the we do similar like mini publics town hall meetings. We assisted the municipalities in order to conduct town hall meeting, invite the people. So they met together in one room. They will start talking about issue that the citizen faces in the municipality, and the mayor he answer the questions, and sometimes they vote for priorities projects. So I think I like the idea of mini publics, and I think it's similar to the town hall meetings, right?
It's the selection that's different. And I think that's one of the key differences in citizens' juries and citizens' assemblies is that it's not self-selected and it's not random selection. Random being one of those words that I always have to explain to my undergraduates. It doesn't really mean random selection. But it is a stratified random sample, so it's a very careful social scientific application of statistics to select certain people. And so I think that's where the difference is between a town hall or town meeting and a citizens jury, and what really sets this citizens jury process apart is that sampling process of how you get those people that are there. Is that so? I'm thinking that's one of the core
Oh yeah, absolutely.
pieces.
Yeah, no.
Well, go ahead.
Yeah, and I would say, I mean, from my perspective, the core elements that you talked about really are some form of random or stratified selection process, that it's not whoever wants to show up, that it's multiple days for a jury process, that take that for however you want, multiple days, background information and multiple perspectives that are shared as potential solutions. And I would also just say broadly construed a generative component. So they make something
Generative,
together.
yeah.
That's what sets it apart from a deliberative poll, is you can have a poll and not have anything outside of that. And that's totally fine. That isn't, but that is the differentiator, where that the work of the group somehow they create something collectively, and whatever that might look like. And at most basic, to me, those are the core elements that set it apart. And each of those can be in other processes, but that particular combination of things is my perspective on it, and that may change or shift a little bit, but those at least are the key pieces I see that set it apart.
And are there if those things were true in the process for town hall style meetings, and if, which are two big ifs, recognize the population that attended community town hall meetings, thank you, were representative in some capacity of the broader public to which it was serving, what would be the important, what would make this more preferential? Like, what would the smaller group and the model for mini publics do that didn't
What
do?
are the advantages of random selection as opposed to having anybody come who wants to come?
Well, and yeah, with those two big ifs, which I realize are not always in reality there, which is representative attendance and a process to which the community members are able to take action in some form together in the ways that you were just describing.
Well, if you can, if self-selection produced a really representative group,
Mhm.
That would get the same outcome as random selection. I'd say in the vast majority of cases, it's unlikely.
Yes.
It's
I
very
agree.
unlikely, for a whole lot of reasons that you're probably very familiar with. So one advantage, one reason that random selection needs to be in the mix, I think there's an important role for self-selection. But the reasons that random selection needs to be in the mix is you get a more representative group. You get a group where there's a lot less danger of what Joe was calling tribalism. It's a lot easier to get them to work together on a problem rather than my side's got to beat your side. I've got to beat you. And the third thing, which is that it's a lot harder for any groups with a lot of money and a lot of power to manipulate.
Right.
In California and in San Francisco and wherever, all the time I see public participation processes where very well-funded groups pack the room with their grassroots supposedly supporters, and they pack the stage with their fancy presentations, and it's just manipulated. It's really hard to do that with the mini public.
Well, one of the differences is the group size, because you all are limiting, very strictly limiting the size of the group, which means it's possible to deliberate over a
Right.
course of a few days as opposed to a few years, right? So a town meeting, you don't have those limitations on group size, and so all of a sudden, I mean, you're
Absolutely.
dealing with,
The group size is a clear differentiator.
Yeah.
And I do not think that town hall meetings are done well today. They're not representative and they're not facilitated well, and community members usually don't feel effective in them. In rare cases they do, and right now in the US they have like a spike in utility from the resistance groups. But by and large, I would not think they're done well today. I'm more thinking like if when we're rolling this out, what if you were to optimize both processes, right? Like if you did 2 communities one way and 2 communities the other way, you could really control everything. Which one is optimal? So sorry, I'm getting to the original question I was asking, but I am curious about it to then understand what you would want to fight for at a larger level, in part because it feels like this takes a lot of investment every single time you run the process. And for neighborhood associations or town hall meetings, it's a structure that persists over time. Yeah,
Well, I would just say that, like,
thanks.
it might not be helpful to look at, town hall versus citizens jury, because you could have, you could feasibly use random selection as
Yes.
part of forming a town hall process that is
Yeah.
a standing body. It wouldn't be like a traditional student government that's elected versus a student citizens jury that only lasts 3 days. Like, we can use certain elements that are used in citizens juries to form a standing student council.
Absolutely.
So I try to think of these more as methods or tools, right? And different, so you have citizens juries and citizens assemblies and consensus conferences and mini publics and panels, and now in Toronto the 2-year panels
Yeah.
and stuff. And they're making use of some of the same tools. Some are really large, actually,
you could do it.
and they do breakout groups, and so it's kind of like a buffet of tools. I don't know,
And hopefully complementary, because you don't want to overtax citizens with the large things. So
Yeah.
some of the breakout groups, like with your student groups.
And just one last thing I wanted to say is that the random selection doesn't always have to be super complicated. In our schools, for example, we control for gender, and we typically control for grade level, or even classroom. And the way that we do that is we have a really simple random selection process that involves colored beans, and students reach in, but we'll separate them out. So it's only male students in this one, and only female students in that one, and we know that they'll have the same number of purple beans that will get selected. And we'll just do it separately in different classrooms if we want each classroom to be represented. So again, kind of the lay terminology around stratified random sample is kind of can scare people, but the idea being that it generally looks like the population that you want to serve.
And I think part of this is a question of scale versus just depth too, because like we talk about, how does this scale up to national level issues? Where I tend to go with it. My own particular take is thinking about functions of government and what are the functions of government that need improvement. And my lens is the CIR, so I think about how do you increase accountability, basically, with this particular model. And that's about it. And that's not to say there aren't like many, many different ways that you can scale up, and there are people working on national level issues with things that are kind of like quasi-deliberative polls and so on. But what I find really interesting is how do you increase accountability playing to the strengths of the particular small group deliberative mini public, which I really do believe are these strengths of having a fair, legitimate process that is in depth, that ultimately can hold, if you structure it within a system of laws that can increase accountability fundamentally. But it's not really answering your question. But those are my own particular take on it.
So, if I could, so one of the things I keep hearing about too is that often or frequently it is a defined scope and a defined duration, whereas town meetings tend to be these long-term, in perpetuity sorts of events.
Town meetings, actually, town meeting and town hall meeting are very different. Town meeting is a New England and especially Vermont tradition where folks actually make laws. It's a really interesting and very underrated democratic, one of the few good things about American democracy. town hall meetings typically are not long duration. They're typically very short, and each person maybe gets to ask one question and not even respond to the answer.
Yeah.
And I would say the question of national scale, I think is open. We're lucky and in a position to be exploring a project that would look at what would the issues be, what would be the parameters, and what would actually be a desired outcome of a process that incorporated a citizens jury, some variation, on an issue of national relevance. That is going to take a lot of work to try to figure out what that actually might be, who the audience would be, what the mechanism would be, and the secondary question is, what are the auxiliary or accompanying strategies, both in terms of other in-person and digital engagement, as well as just communications and outreach that would be necessary to have anyone know about it, right? And that's where I think the enormity of operating at a national level in the U.S., I think, is beyond the purview in some cases of our global colleagues who will say, well, why don't you just go talk to Congress? Or, it's just not the same. And it's a different, you have to be really clear about what you're trying to accomplish, because our political system is so enormous, and by that I mean both the government itself and the just the scale of electioneering and professional political apparatus is how you would marshal resources to actually make an impact on that, given the relatively minuscule amounts of support and resources available, is really difficult. I mean, it's so big, and there's so much money involved, and so many vested interests, that it's really difficult to think about what is the right strategy and what's the right issue or set of issues where there might be real value for improvement.
And some of the strategies for this, I mean, America Speaks worked on developing some really very large, nationally centered projects. There's a group called Voice of the People that runs broad-scale polls. There's like two really clear sides of the coin of working externally from government to influence national level politics in particular, that is on one half trying to demonstrate what these projects usually do, is like try to demonstrate what the more authentic will of the public would be, devoid of special interest influence and more in-depth and deliberative to find out what people actually think. And it's always kind of positioned as, here's what the people really want you, elected representative, to go do, or congressperson to go do. And the flip side of it that's oftentimes, I think, more reported in the news is there's like a public shaming aspect to it as well, in terms of strategies where, because you run an event and that event says we should have done X instead of Y, therefore all of you are wrong and not representative. And I don't know, like, that work is done a bit less now than it used to be, but the question of scale is such a different structure than working at the state level. But
sorry.
No, go ahead.
I'm thinking a couple things about, first of all, I don't have any particular things to propose in the United States, even though I live here and lived here all my life. I suspect that the way this stuff will take off will be municipal first in a lot of places, and then all of a sudden you see a state or region, or maybe you even see a small country before you see a state or a region, and then it goes to another before it ever gets to, like, the United States. Having said that, there's some real serious conversations going on in the European Union, because there's a tremendous amount of dissatisfaction among the people in the countries in the European Union with the EU and its government and so forth. And I think there's a window of opportunity to make some real changes. What and about 10 of the democracy R&D organizations are involved in a project where the basic idea, we wrote up a proposal and people are shopping around with people in the European Union and the European Parliament representatives in their home countries to do some kind of like what we did in Geelong in Australia and what the Jefferson Center did with the Minnesota Citizens Assembly, which is, except you do it not once, but every year or every 2 years, you convene a representative sample of the public, or in this case, it would be first separate samples in each country and then a sample of the samples together in Brussels. And you ask them, and you give them real time to do this. And you send out a call for proposals. How could we improve democracy in the European Union, increase trust in Parliament, incorporate ordinary citizens more into policy making? So you send out the call of proposals, you have the review process, you narrow it down, and first people deliberate about pieces of it separately, and then you bring them together. That's the basic proposal that we're shopping around. No idea if that's going to fly politically, but if it did, I think it could be viable. It's partly based on the submission that we did to the Global Challenges Prize about the United Nations. There are also several books and a number of articles with some fairly well thought out proposals for replacing one house of legislature like the U.S. House of Representatives with a randomly selected body. My personal favorite says don't use one body, use multiple bodies with separate functions, limited powers, less complicated checks and balances. So there's actually some pretty good, very specific stuff out there, but it isn't collected. I'm working on collecting it.
One thing I'll say, segueing your question earlier about the national potential versus working in neighborhoods to kind of scale up, so you have neighborhood associations and perspective from, say, Latin America and social movements in Latin America, where there's neighborhood associations in every neighborhood and such, that may have some overlap with Burundi and Uganda, is that trying to kind of confederate those neighborhood associations or, particular factory unions that then join a union confederation stuff, you typically get a centralization of power in those representatives that then they become quite distant from their bases and kind of entrenched. And oftentimes in Bolivia, you see it time and again where they betray the rank and file or the neighborhood level people, and then either end up in the government with some posh position or those types of things. And so that's one of the real drawbacks, I feel like, of kind of traditional grassroots models of scaling, is that these delegates that are supposedly tied to their base oftentimes end up acting a lot like elected officials, and whereas random selection has a way of having everyday rank and file members of the community or the union or whatnot be in those positions for a short time and not make a career of it, and so that's one advantage.
Thanks.
I'll maybe try to segue here a little bit. One of the questions was, how do we talk about this in ways that are relevant to other people? And I think avoiding everything that we've talked about today is primarily, and I'm not even joking, I am, but at the same time I'm not. I go into meetings with potential partners, with community members, with organizations, and with some of our funders, and they have never still heard of what a citizen, they don't need to know what a citizen's jury is. They need to know how we're going to solve problems that they see and what role we play in that. And so as much as possible, and on one hand, now this is admittedly in a context that isn't directly looking in these cases to institutionalize this work within a policy or within a government body. That's a different conversation, but that's a key part of it, because we want to talk about our methods and our processes, and they want to know how something is going to change with something they're stuck on or a problem they're having. And that's a key part of our own drawbacks for ourselves, is we talk about our processes when our process doesn't inherently do anything for someone unless we can demonstrate it's effective at accomplishing something. And I think that's instructive and important to keep in mind that you don't have to, selling the process didn't work at least in the US for 20 to 30 years. It's not going to start doing it now. It's about saying here's how we can support community members in solving problems or identifying priorities or coming up with goals.
But you do have to talk about your competitive advantage, right? I mean, it's more than being able to do it. It's like being able to do it in context. So I'd be curious to hear you talk a bit more about, like, you go into that meeting, what's that actually like? Because speaking from the policy side of it, it was very much, we never spoke about process at all. It was the problem and the lack of viable solutions and why we felt like we had a potential solution. And then it'd be like, well, this is how this thing works. So, I mean, does that make sense to my question?
Yeah. So with our, go with our climate work on this one. So it took a lot of failed proposals and being turned down to finally come up with the approach that the case we're trying to make is that rural communities are not involved in these conversations and individuals because the language processes and the ways that people have these discussions typically take place in urban populations among upper class liberal white people. And that's not a conversation that rural community members want really much to do with. So what would it look like for us to bring people together to have a conversation that is about these issues, that reflects it and that is reflective of their goals, needs, and desires? Because what we're trying to do is look at not how do we turn them into climate voters, it's about what is missing from this conversation that if you're pouring resources into this, that can help you strengthen your relationship with people that you are currently failing to connect with. Here is a way we might do it, is have people come together who are across the political spectrum and have a varying level of understanding and opinion about this issue, and they might come back and say you're crazy for trying to do this here, but on the flip side they may come up with ideas and solutions that you want to see implemented and would be willing to support, and that took an amount of time, but it also took us reorienting what their strategy looked like, because it was about pointing out the failures that they had of every 2 years doing robocalls and polling to identify potential leaning climate voters in 6 upper Midwestern states. Nothing changed, so we said, you're going about your problem, you're asking the wrong questions of the wrong people. Think about a different way of engaging with community members here, and there may be something valuable to your long-term approach of doing this. Took a while. It took time to test it, and then to show some impact. And then this happened with our media work as well, and which was, at times, events take place that point out the errors in strategy that people have. We had about eight solid media partners throughout 2016 for our media work, which was focused around how do you better reflect the information, needs, and desires of your community members. The 2016 election happened, and we now have 36 because the problems we were attempting to solve became very apparent in the way that media has seen its relationship change to particularly people who are not well-educated, savvy media consumers. And so I remember trying to have the conversation explaining a citizen's jury to former New York Times editor who was deciding whether or not this was money well spent, and it was terrible. And she didn't buy it. And it was later saying, here's what we know we can deliver that other groups, that other methods of audience engagement aren't going to get you. That was a different conversation that eventually got them on board. And it was very different, though, than we're going to bring people together, go through this stratified process. That just raises more questions than we'll get different people to have this discussion, and it will provide these opportunities.
And I think that goes back to some of the earlier commentary and questions around both competitive advantage versus something like a focus group. And big, I mean, I'm not comparing to. And also the strength of the process in terms of analytical depth and rigor that we all know it can do. So thanks for sharing that story. Is there questions?
I just wanted to add and kind of highlight the importance of trying to figure out what might resonate with the people you're trying to convince, right? And it's going to be different things. You take different strategies. So when we go in and talk to schools, learn the hard way. We started trying to get everybody excited about experimenting with democratic alternatives. And these teachers just and so then we realized, okay, we're going to talk about inclusion, the learning opportunities, right? I mean, what's your audience? And last month in New Orleans, in one very marginalized neighborhood of color, what really resonated with people was not, you avoid the technical jargon, but starting out with questions about how they feel about politics, if they feel like they're represented, and then asking something like, how would you feel or would you like to see legislatures filled with everyday people that look like you and people from your community, who shared your experiences? And they say, yeah, and then you segue into how you might be able to do that. Then I go to a quite well-to-do neighborhood and knocking on doors and thinking I'm gonna have the conversation in a similar way. Would you like to see legislators that look like you? But the guy looked just like Mitch McConnell. He's like, at a certain time.
They already do.
They do. So I found with that population, it was more, would you like to see legislatures filled with everyday people that didn't make a career out of being in politics, right? And people say, yeah, I'm tired of that. And so you have to figure out if it's a neighborhood, if it's foundation, if it's Uganda, like what's going to resonate with people. If it's policymakers, it's a whole different conversation. Right? And like Kyle says, avoid the technical stuff at all costs.
So do you all test messaging then? I mean, you all talked a little bit about, someone did.
We did.
Yeah.
We did a lot of that for a while, and then we quit doing it. But
Was that important? Do you think
yeah,
ultimately? Sorry, I didn't mean to jump in, but that just made me...
It was marginally helpful, I think. It validated some of what we're talking about right now, which I think we all kind of knew, but we wanted validation. Like, you don't get into the weeds and talk about process when you really need to be talking about the problems that are important to people.
Right.
Well, you and Kyle both had a background in politics and campaigns, so you had a sense of how to talk to these people and what sorts of needs they have, whereas someone like me, I'm like, I'd have no idea, right? So that you may have already had an advantage coming in doing that messaging.
Ian Walker.
I wish the campaigns I worked on had spent more time on that question.
Ian Walker at New Democracy has a great way to, what has been in Australia, for him, a very effective way to talk to politicians. He doesn't tell them about this great model we have or something. He doesn't start out by telling anything. He asks them, what's hard?
Yeah. What's the problem that you have?
And, what's hard about your job? He actually literally just says it, those two words, and lets them talk, and asks them a few questions and draws them and lets them talk. And from there, figures out where to open the conversation.
Awesome.
And I'll say that part of it has just been learning as we go too. When I first started interacting particularly with state legislators, about 4 or 5 years ago now, my first conversations with a group of legislators who were assembled to talk about their constituent engagement practices. And the person there who was most familiar with our work was like, sorry, Kyle, you have no idea what you're talking about. Like you are not speaking their language at all. And it took 4 years and actual, like, on the ground, like, literally asking them questions and to mimic and frame our work in language that is valuable and actually reflects their experience. And it's difficult to do because it's each different place, has its own norms and standards and those things. And Camille has now attended some of those conversations, both at the district and congressional level, and I think maybe state or city at least. And it's a different conversation than what I would have with other people. And primarily, the key part of that has been listening more than talking, and which is what you're saying as well. I think it's a key part that too often been a solution in search of a problem rather than trying to understand where our strengths are and how to apply them to places that people are having difficulty.
I can add a little experience in Brazil. I don't know if you know that we are one of the champions in the world in social media. Brazilians love social media. But Brazilians are also tired of fighting in the social media because all this tribalism in the social, and the last years, it's terrible. People have fights, terrible fights in social medias and WhatsApp and things. So one of the arguments that we have been using, and it's attractive, is the term citizen mode. We say, oh, the liberation brings people to the citizen mode more, and instead of the consumer mode, because also for who is concerned with participation, political participation, social projects, they also leads with this rights. Oh, this is my right, my right, my right. So everybody's thinking about his own right and not the collective goal. And so the citizen modes is an argument that we think it's powerful because it brings this collective way of thinking and even for people who is trying to do something in social terms, they are not gonna fight over it. They are gonna work together. So this work together in Brazil is very powerful.
That's nice to hear.
Yeah.
I guess I would, now that I'm thinking about it, I guess I would reframe the question of, or maybe add to the question of how to talk about this work and start with how to listen about this work or something like that.
Yeah.
It's like what questions to ask to get people talking and listen that then lead into that conversation.
So I think as we wrap up, it might be good to return to David's question of kind of what are some of the things that stand out as concerns that you see or doubts that you might have about some of this.
I think the biggest concern, I mean, if I am approaching, and I want to see if people do this, but if I were to sort of advocate for this as a model, which you can't do as a researcher, but if I were to write a little white paper or something, is cost. I mean, the first question is why do it? If we're going outside of government, to really talk about accountability in a different way for actors who are involved in the policy process. And I think, I mean, you all sort of answered that, purpose meaning these deeper levels of accountability, citizen voice and inclusion, so you answered that. But I think the cost issue is a bit, I mean, these are big numbers in dollars that you're talking about. And so to me, I think that's the greatest challenge is, and I think that's the challenge for anybody doing any work in the social sector, are resources and costs. So how do you sell the costs, I guess? And those are sort of connected. I mean, and that's this.
Do you mean in
purposeful-
government or say in philanthropy or civil society?
Or anywhere, government, civil society, philanthropy, you know, how do you sell the purposefulness? I don't know if sell is the right word, advocate, articulate, you know, for this work to others. And I don't expect you to necessarily, I mean, you answered it throughout the day.
I mean, I can give
but I
two
see that as a
examples
challenge.
of
Yeah.
different examples.
You
that,
did,
that,
right.
One of them with like our climate work, we can talk about the things that have changed in that community, but also on the flip side, we invested however much it was for each jury event in 3 communities, and in 2 of those communities, that money goes directly into to like a mini incentive or a mini stimulus package for rural communities of people getting paid and us utilizing local resources and buying food and such. But 2 of those 3 communities have now received, as a result, state grants in excess of what it costs to put on the event, that to go and actually implement the ideas that came out of them. So that was money that went to hire people in the community to do some of this stuff, to pay for some of the projects. That's one aspect. The other, and this is what we're trying to see from media partners, is there a way to demonstrate that stories and content produced using these practices actually boost the engagement of readers, viewers, listeners, and have a direct bottom line benefit to their business. So are people more willing to pay for articles or spend more
So that
time
competitive
thereby?
advantage,
So those
right,
are
yeah.
2 different aspects of how we look at it for those things.
And I'll add one that I'm mixed on just because of the result, but when we were advocating for the CIR and establishing it, we quantified the problem as best we could. Part of that would be, the relevant campaign expenditures, which are on this chart. It's just like a rocket taking off.
Right.
And then also the, fiscal impact of the measures that program may or may not impact. And I say with a grain of salt because obviously the CIR in Oregon has challenges. But I think it's an important thing to keep in mind as well. So it is a big ticket item.
Right.
And it requires problems that are weighty enough to warrant their use.
In Australia, and I don't know if this applies outside, but in Australia, we haven't had much problem with the cost.
Oh, interesting.
Because except after our first experiment with the Australian Citizens Parliament, after that, after Ian's done lots of his research about what's hard, we've found situations where convening a mini public and pretty much following what they recommend solves a problem that's giving people big headaches and causing them lots of sleepless nights. And if it can do that, they spend lots more money about lots of other things that don't solve that kind of problem. So it hasn't been an issue. I'm not saying at all this applies everywhere. And I also think that, like Adam's point is really good about what about bottom-up approaches. I've seen that there are people in other organizations in democracy R&D that have totally worked outside of politics, just with communities, and now the politicians are coming to them. They've had success. I mean, this has worked for us, and what Democracy in Practice has done something real different that's worked for them.
I was just going to quickly add that, you can be really creative about costs as well, right? And Tyrone and I were talking to the break, not letting perfect be the enemy of the good.
Right.
And it doesn't necessarily have to be a full-blown citizens jury or citizens assembly or a CIR process. So a foundation, typically they have different boards.
Right.
How are they selected?
Right.
Can you get creative? It might not be this huge, we're going to randomly select from all of our different clients, and then we're going to form a 5-day process and fly them in. But it could be something like, we're going to have a board that is randomly selected from employees at all levels and rotated, or clients if it's a foundation doing work abroad, okay, in those neighborhoods, right? For a 1-day get together, like there's different ways you could do it that might be more cost effective. That don't have to be like the full-blown citizens jury model.
One I'd say too, the formal adoption of these things really comes if our U.S. government and culture just doesn't reward, or where Australia and Canada are 2 places where these are adopted more formally, and other countries because they have actual legislation or policies or ordinances at the federal, state, or local level that require consultation of some sort related to some decision making. And so in areas where that's not just an expectation but a mandate, as problems or as issues get more complex, they'll seek more complicated solutions. And so that's why we see other places that have norms and expectations politically around just consultation with community members or residents, constituents, and we just don't have that in the U.S. And that's where our work is very different, because how do we demonstrate that adoption of these practices in some form is a better form of, or better governing strategy or whatever decision-making strategy. And it's less likely that this is not going to be someone's first attempt at this, right? And so, like, no one's going to be like, well, I've never done this before, but you know what? Let's spend $150,000 on this. Let's go for it. When they could simply convene a smaller group of, for an afternoon rather than like, it's never going to be let's go
Bigger,
from point A to
dot,
point
dot,
B.
dot.
Yeah. So that's the unique place where we find ourselves here in the U.S., where it's just a slightly different expectation than what place people and practitioners in other countries are working with.
So you asked about concerns. This is sort of going to answer it, but in sort of a weird way. So I'm coming back to something that Adam said a while ago, that it's another tool in our toolbox. And at IAP2, we have a course called Foundations in Effective Public Participation, and we have identified roughly 50 different techniques that can be used to accomplish public participation goals, and this is one of them. And one of the things that we try and teach in that class is sometimes you find a technique that you really think is totally cool and you really want to try it, but you choose the tool based on the purpose that or the problem that you're trying to solve. And so what I've sort of arrived at here today is that this is a really cool tool or a compilation of tools that we can use. I may go through my entire career practice in public engagement and never get to use this. But now I know what it is, how it is used, and really, ideally, what sorts of solutions it can solve. And so if I'm ever in the position where I have an issue, a problem that needs to be solved, and this would be the right tool, I can pull it out of my toolbox. That's not good for folks like at Jefferson Center or Healthy Democracy or those that are advocating for this, because it doesn't fit every issue, and I'm sure that you've come to grips with that yourself. That it's like, okay, it's not the be all and end all of everything, but it's really cool. And I think for the purposes that you have described to us today, the examples, oh my gosh, it is the ideal tool for many of those purposes. We just need to be very cautious about not applying it where it may not be needed.
Yeah, I mean, we really went for years without an organizational strategy, and at this point, our core programmatic focus is on climate change and community resilience, patient engagement and health policy development, and broader issues around democratic innovation. Outside of that, people may come to us with ideas of, could we do this X, Y, or Z, or are there opportunities to work? But those are the areas for us where it's worth investing our time, because they're not going away, and they're not the type of issues that, they are the type of issues that are well suited for bringing people together to learn about these things before making decisions.
Yeah.
And so that's where we spend our time, and that doesn't mean that people won't come to us and say, is this something you're interested in? And if it meets criteria, we'll do it. But I'm not out, and nor is Camille out trying to find new ways to implement this on planning. Like, it's not where we are, because there's so many different well-developed planning engagement strategies and those things. So,
Yeah.
I think it's helpful to distinguish between, when you say this or this tool, to distinguish between concepts that I was laying out earlier this morning: random selection, deliberation, consensus. And then there's another level below that, which is citizen jury, citizens assembly, deliberative poll, consensus conference. And then there's probably even another level below that of exactly, how do you do each little thing? In each case, even at the most general level, it's not for everything, but the higher you go up in the level, the more applicable.
Yeah.
Random selection is applicable to a very wide variety of things. Personally, I think random selection is really good for setting agendas, reviewing proposals, and deciding. I don't think it's good for developing. I think self-selection is good for developing proposals and commenting. And elections, I'm not sure. The jury's still out. There's part of me that says, I don't know what elections are good for at all, really. Other than that, they exist and we have to work with them, which is hugely important. So we always do that. I'm not sure. Appointment. Deliberation, I think, is useful in a wide variety of contexts, but it's also useful for many publics to hear debate between advocates on different sides who are just doing the full-on adversarial debate, if they can weigh those arguments and so forth. Same thing with consensus. There are lots of my preferred decision process. Default is consensus, but there's a lot of situations that don't fit the default, and different types of voting are useful. The multiple, like the dot voting that people do, cumulative voting, that has a lot of potential, especially in cases where you have groups of people where you have structural oppression of some kind, and some groups never win on anything. You do the dot voting kind of thing, and anybody can win a certain percentage of the time. So there's a lot of room even at that level.
I'm going to segue off of that for just a second to answer the question posed about concerns. And it's funny because I'm always mixed about the discussion about tools and toolkits. And I took the foundations class, which I thought was a lot of fun in BC, and citizen jury was in there. And there's definitely that aspect of this work, which is a tool. As a practitioner, you can pull out of your toolkit and apply if the context calls for it. There's also like that level that David just described of discrete use and application of this work, and that's where I think the CIR fits. And I've always likened this, as one of many options to electoral reform, and view it much more in the sense of good governance than I do deliberative democracy. Okay, my fear, I think, my concern is it won't be able to segue its way out of the deliberative context of citizen juries and enter into the discussion of good governance. And part of that is semantics, how we talk about it. Part of it is history. Part of it is organizational business models and like the realities of running a nonprofit that requires funding and so on. But my hope for this work, and I think that we'll get there in many different ways that can't be anticipated given all the work that's going on, is the ideas that come out of deliberative methods, whether they be mini publics or whatnot, can enter into all these other spheres of activity for governance to like affect change, because they affect change, not because they're a particular tool in the toolkit.
Right.
If that makes sense. So
Yeah.
That makes total sense. That's what I want to see if philanthropy is doing it, if they can shift their governance model, at least towards policy making.
Okay.
Yeah, and I think once people buy it as a governance tool, that we govern this way, that that it might resonate more using whatever appropriate language, So I think that's exciting.
Actually, accountability practices.
Right, right.
It's not a deliberative thing per se. It's about its effect more so.
I
Right.
think the idea of using some kind of mini public consultation / accountability in philanthropy is a really exciting one. I thought that when Manuel wrote his little one-page concept paper, but the thing that stopped me at the time was, how do you figure out who's the maxi public that you want to be representative of? And then today the light bulb went on. It's like, find foundations who have a defined geographic scope. Like we serve Chicago, we serve the Bay Area, we serve Northern Georgia.
Right.
And I would be glad to help you think that through and put you
Yeah,
in
yeah.
touch with Manuel and
Right.
other folks. That would be a very cool project.
This has been a very inspiring, exciting day to me. I know I
Yes.
probably overspoke, and I apologize.
It would
but-
not, it
Yeah.
would not take very
Yeah.
long to
Yeah.
figure out the
Right.
basic and to sort of outline the basic concept of here's the problem, here's what people have already suggested and why it's not working yet.
Right,
Here's a new solution, what would it take?
right.
Very cool.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I think we are at time. So thanks everyone for your participation and joining us. I don't know that we have a solid plan. Other than if anyone was interested in happy hour, I'd be happy to join you. Otherwise, I think we just need to wrap up and clean up what we brought in.
Yeah.
Otherwise, that's pretty much what we have. Being not great process people in this case, we don't have a survey for you to fill out today.
But we could make one.
we could easily make one, and we would value your any thoughts, feedback, questions that come afterwards, any follow-up, and we'd be happy to do that. And we really just want to thank you for being here, and thanks Ty and David for organizing.
I like my Scotland.
Yeah.
Kyle.
Thank you,
So
absolutely.
Camille prepared the handouts and other things today, and thanks for that as well.
And just to, so everyone knows, the resources document is available if we are gonna create a post survey, we can include the link to it, but there's a bit.ly link in there.
Cool.
And so you can see all of the content that's available on it, but